I didn't hear the whispers at first. Not the ones from the people around me, nor the ones in my own head. It was during Karen's big event at the community center, a showcase for her archaeology club. I was the dutiful husband, sipping lukewarm punch, smiling at strangers, and nodding at anyone who complimented her display. Karen, in her element, buzzed around the room, charming the guests with tales of ancient artifacts and half-dramatic anecdotes about treasures unearthed. She glowed. But then, so did he. The whispers started when Karen's hand lingered just a beat too long on his arm. He was tall, rugged, and looked like he belonged in some glossy history documentary. Dr. James Whittaker. I'd heard about him before, a guest expert she wouldn't stop gushing about. This was my first time seeing him, though, and the first time I caught the way her laughter was a bit too free when he spoke. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just Karen being Karen and friendly, passionate about her hobbies, a little over the top in front of an audience. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the growing unease in my chest. At one point, Karen walked by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, her voice light and teasing. "Thomas, can you believe how much interest there is in this old stuff?" I smiled, playing the part of supportive husband. But my eyes flicked to James. He was watching her like she was the most fascinating relic in the room. Later, when the crowd thinned, I stepped outside for some air. That's when I heard voices from around the side of the building. Low, close, and familiar. Karen and James. I couldn't see them, but their tone was unmistakable, intimate, hushed. My stomach twisted as I edged closer, hiding behind the corner. I didn't want to listen, but I couldn't walk away. "I just wish we had more time," Karen was saying. "You know how tricky this is," James replied. "But I'll figure something out. For us. For us." The words hit me like a gut punch. My breath caught, and for a second, I felt like I might pass out. Karen's laugh followed, soft and nervous. "I hate sneaking around. It's exhausting." "Just a little longer," James murmured. I didn't need to hear more. I stepped back, my legs trembling, my heart racing. My mind raced, too, flipping through a dozen possibilities, excuses, or explanations that might make this less damning. But there weren't any. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to look back. I stayed up late that night, pretending to watch TV in the living room. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, as if every sound Karen made carried a weight I'd never noticed before. She came home after midnight, later than usual, and didn't seem the least bit concerned that I was still awake. "Long night?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Karen smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah. Everyone wanted to talk to James about the dig. He's quite the star." I nodded and turned back to the screen, watching her from the corner of my eye. She was moving quickly, her purse clutched tight against her side as she disappeared into the bedroom. I heard the lock click. Locking the door wasn't normal for her. I stayed where I was, processing everything I'd overheard at the community center. I knew now that something was going on, but I didn't have the full picture. Not yet. And I couldn't accuse her of anything without proof. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to Karen's behavior. She'd become more guarded, more preoccupied. Her phone was always within arm's reach, and she rarely left it unattended. But her real mistake wasn't in what she was hiding, it was in what she forgot to hide. Karen had been gushing for weeks about a field trip her archaeology group was planning, an overnight dig about 2 hours away. It was all she talked about, how excited she was to work with James and the others. I hadn't thought much of it at first. But now, her eagerness felt different, more calculated. I decided to dig a little myself. The night before her trip, Karen went to bed early. She'd been exhausted from planning, or so she said. Once I was sure she was asleep, I slipped into the garage and checked the trunk of her car. She was meticulous about packing for trips, and sure enough, her bag was already loaded. I unzipped the bag carefully, sifting through clothes, notebooks, and her usual archaeology tools. Everything seemed normal until I found a small envelope tucked between her journals. Inside were 2 tickets, one for her and one for James, to a hotel in the town near the dig site. 2 tickets. 1 room. My chest tightened as I stared at the confirmation slip, the details laid out so plainly it was almost laughable. I slipped the envelope back into its place and closed the bag, careful not to disturb anything else. The next morning, I acted like everything was fine. Karen kissed me goodbye, her mood brighter than it had been in weeks. "I'll call you tonight," she said, smiling as she climbed into the car. I waved her off, my stomach churning as I watched her drive away. Once she was gone, I went back inside and grabbed my keys. If Karen thought I was just going to sit at home and let this unfold, she didn't know me as well as she thought. The drive to the hotel was uneventful, but my mind was racing the entire time. What was I even expecting to find? I knew what the evidence suggested, but there was still a part of me, stupidly hopeful, that clung to the idea that this might all be some misunderstanding. When I arrived, I parked a few spaces away from her car and waited. An hour passed, then another, and I was starting to think I'd jumped the gun when I saw them. Karen and James. They came out of the hotel together, laughing and talking as if they didn't have a care in the world. She was holding his arm, leaning into him like they were teenagers sneaking off to prom. I stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My instincts screamed at me to confront them, to march over and demand answers. But I couldn't do it, not yet. Not without seeing exactly how far this had gone. I followed them at a distance as they left the parking lot and headed toward the dig site. It was a small, secluded area surrounded by trees, with only a handful of cars parked nearby. They didn't seem to notice me, too wrapped up in their own world. I waited until they disappeared into the site before getting out of my car. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to calm down as I approached the edge of the clearing. I stayed hidden, watching as they set up their equipment and started working. At first, everything seemed professional. They were focused on the dig, their movements precise and deliberate. But then, during a break, James leaned in close to Karen, his hand resting on her lower back. She didn't pull away. They talked quietly for a moment, their faces so close I thought they might kiss. Then Karen laughed, the sound cutting through the stillness like a knife. I turned away, my stomach churning. I'd seen enough. On the drive back, I replayed the scene in my head, trying to make sense of it. There was no denying what I'd witnessed. Karen and James were more than just colleagues. They were something else entirely, something that had no place in my life. When I got home, I sat in the dark for hours, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her the moment she walked through the door, to lay it all out and demand an explanation. But another part of me knew that wouldn't be enough. I needed to plan. I needed to make sure this wasn't just a temporary blow-up, something she could talk her way out of. If Karen wanted to tear apart our marriage, I was going to make damn sure she didn't get to do it on her terms. The discovery was complete. Now it was time for the next step. Karen came home 2 days later, just as cheerful and relaxed as when she'd left. She breezed through the door with a bright smile, a duffel bag over her shoulder, and a kiss planted lazily on my cheek. "Miss me?" she asked. I nodded, watching her carefully. She didn't notice anything was off, or maybe she was just that good at pretending. Either way, her nonchalance only confirmed what I already knew. Karen wasn't going to come clean unless I forced her hand. We had dinner together that night, pasta, her favorite, and she went on and on about the dig. Not about James, though. She didn't even mention his name, which struck me as odd considering how often she talked about him before. I decided not to confront her right away. I wanted her to think she'd gotten away with it, that I was none the wiser. Let her build her little house of lies a bit higher before I knocked it down. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I went through her bag again. The hotel receipt was still there, along with a small velvet pouch I hadn't seen before. Inside was a simple gold bracelet, nothing flashy, but clearly not something Karen would have bought for herself. I left everything as it was and went to work, my mind buzzing with questions. By the time I got home that evening, I'd made up my mind. "Karen," I said after dinner, leaning back in my chair. "We need to talk." Her eyes flicked up from her plate, wary but not yet alarmed. "What's up?" "About the dig," I said. "How was it, really?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching. It was great, she said, her voice a little too even. Why? No reason, I said. Just curious. She relaxed slightly and started clearing the table, humming to herself as if nothing was wrong. But when she reached for her bag to take it upstairs, I stood and blocked her path. What's this? I asked, holding up the bracelet. Karen froze. For a moment, her face was a mix of surprise and something else, guilt, maybe, or anger. It's just a bracelet, she said, her tone defensive. Who gave it to you? I asked. Her eyes narrowed. What are you getting at, Thomas? I think you know, I said, keeping my voice calm. You want to explain why you have a hotel receipt for a room booked for 2, or should I start guessing? Her face went pale, and she stepped back, clutching the bag like it was some kind of shield. You went through my things? You left it in the open, I said. You've been acting strange for weeks, Karen. What was I supposed to think? She didn't answer right away, her hands trembling as she set the bag down on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold. So, what? She snapped. You're spying on me now? That's who we are? Don't turn this around on me, I said, my patience wearing thin. I know about James. I saw you with him at the dig site. Finally, she let out a bitter laugh. And what exactly did you see? Enough, I said. Enough to know you've been lying to me. She stared at me, her expression hardening. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain it, I said. Explain the hotel room, the bracelet, the way you talk to him when you think no one's listening. Karen didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood there, staring at the floor like she was trying to come up with an excuse. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. It's not what you think. Then what is it? I asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're having an affair. Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing. Don't you dare accuse me of that. I'm not accusing you, I said. I'm telling you what I know. So why don't you save us both some time and admit it? Karen's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, I thought she might actually hit me. Instead, she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I followed her upstairs, my anger boiling over. You don't get to just walk away from this, I said, pushing the door open. She spun around to face me, tears streaming down her face. You have no idea what it's been like, she said, her voice breaking. You're so wrapped up in your own little world, you don't even see me anymore. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I asked. It means I'm not happy, she said. I haven't been happy for a long time, Thomas. Then why didn't you say something? I demanded. Why sneak around with him instead of talking to me? Karen shook her head, wiping her eyes. Because you wouldn't have listened. You never listen. I stared at her, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think this was just some cry for help. But another part of me couldn't ignore the evidence, the lies, the secrecy, the way she'd looked at James. This isn't about me not listening, I said. It's about you making a choice. And you chose him. She didn't deny it this time. Instead, she sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You've said enough, I said. Now it's my turn. I turned and left the room, slamming the door behind me. The days following our confrontation were a study in silence. Karen didn't try to explain further or deny it again. She must have realized the damage was done. We went through the motions of sharing a home, barely speaking, avoiding each other when possible, and sleeping in separate rooms. It gave me time to think. Karen might have been content to let things hang in this unresolved limbo, but I wasn't. I couldn't sit idly by and let her betrayal go unanswered. I needed to do something, not out of spite, but to take back control of my life. The first step was gathering evidence. While Karen seemed oblivious to the legal and financial implications of her actions, I wasn't. If this was heading toward divorce, I wasn't about to be blindsided. I took the hotel receipts, the bracelet, and even downloaded the photos she'd taken with James from her cloud account. It wasn't hard, considering her login credentials were still saved on our shared computer. Next, I started thinking about how to make her feel the same shock and humiliation I'd felt. But revenge wasn't just about hurting her. It was about exposing the truth to the people who mattered, to James, to their archaeology friends, and even to the community that had supported Karen's work. I began with the Archaeology Club. They had a group email list, which Karen conveniently accessed through her laptop. I composed a carefully worded email, attaching the most damning photo of her and James, a candid shot of them standing too close at the dig site, her hand on his chest, his arm around her waist. The message was simple. Dear members, as a concerned party and someone who believes in transparency, I feel it's important you know what's been happening behind the scenes. Attached is a photo that might explain Karen and James's enthusiasm for recent club activities. I sent it anonymously, of course. Within hours, the fallout began. Karen's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with calls and texts, but she ignored most of them, her face pale as she sat at the kitchen table. What's wrong? I asked casually, pretending not to know. Nothing, she muttered, her eyes glued to the screen. I could see the panic in her expression. It was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. The next step was James. While I didn't know much about his personal life, I did know he had a reputation to protect. A quick online search revealed he was married, with 2 kids and a teaching position at a nearby university. I printed out the evidence I'd collected, photos, hotel receipts, and even snippets of Karen's notebooks where she'd written about her feelings for him. Then, I mailed everything in a plain envelope to his wife. It was risky, I knew. There was always a chance she wouldn't believe me or would even tell James, tipping him off. But I was banking on her confronting him instead. Let him squirm under the same weight of suspicion and betrayal I'd carried for weeks. The final phase of my plan was personal. Karen had always prided herself on her reputation in the community, particularly as an active member of local events. She'd cultivated this image of a dedicated, passionate woman, always eager to help others. I decided to shatter that illusion. The town's community board had a monthly newsletter, and Karen was scheduled to give a talk at the next meeting about her archaeology group's work. I anonymously submitted a tip to the board, providing just enough detail to make it clear she'd been involved in an inappropriate relationship with James. When Karen found out, she was livid. "You did this, didn't you?" she shouted, slamming her phone on the counter. I didn't deny it. What did you expect, Karen? That I'd sit back and let you keep lying to everyone? You're ruining my life, she screamed. Good, I said. Now you know how it feels. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not sadness, not regret, fear. She knew the walls were closing in, that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. But I wasn't done yet. I scheduled a meeting with a divorce lawyer the following week. Karen didn't know about it, and I planned to keep it that way until the papers were ready. In the meantime, I began quietly moving my personal belongings out of the house, storing them at a friend's place. The night before the papers were served, I sat down with Karen for one final conversation. I'm filing for divorce, I said bluntly. Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she just nodded. I figured, she said softly. Good, I said. Because this is over, Karen. You destroyed us the moment you decided he was worth more than our marriage. She didn't argue, didn't try to explain herself. Maybe she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The next morning, the divorce papers were delivered to her at work. I imagined the look on her face when she opened the envelope, surrounded by her colleagues, and it gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the kind of revenge you see in movies, there were no dramatic confrontations or public humiliations. But it was enough for me to reclaim my dignity, to let Karen know that her betrayal wouldn't go unanswered. When Karen saw the divorce papers, I expected fireworks. Screaming, accusations, maybe even some hollow attempt at begging me to reconsider. But what I got instead was silence. That evening, when I came home, she was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the papers like they were a puzzle she couldn't solve. I dropped my keys on the counter and waited for her to speak. "You're really doing this," she said finally, her voice flat. "Of course I am," I said, pulling out a chair across from her. "What did you think was going to happen, Karen? That I'd just forget everything?" She shook her head slowly, her eyes red and puffy. "I thought we could work through it." I thought. She stopped, pressing her lips together. "Thought what?" I snapped. "That I'd look past the fact you've been sneaking around with another man? Sharing hotel rooms, writing about how he makes you feel alive?" Her head shot up, and for a moment, I thought I saw anger in her expression. But then it faded, replaced by something closer to despair. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then what did you mean?" I asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you threw everything away without a second thought." Karen opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. She glanced down at the papers again, running her fingers over the edge of the top page. "You don't understand," she said finally. "Then make me understand," I said, leaning forward. "Explain to me why the woman I married, the woman I trusted, decided I wasn't enough anymore." She flinched at my words but didn't look away. "It wasn't about you," she said. "It was never about you, Thomas." "Of course it was about me," I shot back. "You can't just pretend this was some isolated thing, Karen. You made a choice. You chose him." Her hands clenched into fists on the table. "I didn't choose him," she said, her voice rising. I don't even know what I chose. She broke off, shaking her head. "You just what?" I demanded. "Wanted a thrill? Wanted to feel young again? What?" Karen's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the woman I'd married, the woman who used to light up every room she walked into, who once made me believe we could face anything together. But that woman was gone now, buried under layers of lies and betrayal. "I felt trapped," she said finally. "Like I was suffocating." "Suffocating?" I repeated, my voice incredulous. "Karen, we had a good life. A stable life. And you felt suffocated?" "It wasn't you," she insisted. "It was me. I needed, I don't know. Something different. Something more." I leaned back in my chair, staring at her like I was seeing her for the first time. "So you risked everything," I said. "You risked our marriage, our life together, for something more." Karen didn't respond. She just sat there, her shoulders slumped, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the span of a week. "Do you even love him?" I asked after a long silence. She looked up at me, startled. "No," she said quickly. "It wasn't about love. It was, I don't know what it was." "Convenient," I said bitterly. "That's what it was." Karen winced but didn't argue. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, Karen broke the silence. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You sign the papers," I said simply. "And then we figure out how to split everything up." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying again. But she didn't. She straightened up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "And that's it?" she asked. 12 years, and it just ends?" "It ended the moment you decided to cheat," I said coldly. Karen flinched but didn't look away. "I didn't want this," she said softly. "Neither did I," I replied. "But here we are." She stared at me for a long time, her eyes searching mine as if she was looking for some glimmer of hope. But there was none. Not anymore. Eventually, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll sign." "Good," I said, standing up. "Because there's nothing left to save here, Karen. Nothing." As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, sadness. But most of all, I felt numb. The last conversation we'd ever have as husband and wife was over. The day Karen signed the divorce papers, I felt a strange sense of finality. Not relief, not satisfaction, just the heavy weight of something finally breaking. She didn't say much as she handed the documents back to me, her hands trembling slightly. I gave her a curt nod and took them without a word. I wasn't sure what I expected in the days that followed. Maybe some kind of apology that would come too late to mean anything. Maybe an outburst, or even an attempt to paint herself as the victim. But Karen didn't do any of that. She stayed quiet, almost like she was trying to fade into the background of her own life. For my part, I kept busy. I had no choice. The house wasn't going to pack itself up, and I wasn't about to let Karen dictate how the split would go. I took what I needed and left the rest. Let her keep the furniture, the kitchen gadgets, the photo albums I didn't care to look at anymore. I just wanted to be done. The day I moved out, Karen was still there. I wondered, briefly, if she felt any regret. If she was finally starting to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. But I didn't ask. I didn't care. I closed the door behind me and didn't look back. Starting over at 42 wasn't something I'd ever planned for, but life doesn't care about plans. The first few weeks were rough. Nights were the worst, the silence stretching out endlessly, giving me too much time to think. I'd lie awake, replaying every argument, every lie, every moment that led to the collapse of our marriage. I wasn't blameless, no one ever is in these situations. But the weight of her betrayal made it hard to see past my own anger. Then there was James. I heard through the grapevine that his wife had left him after receiving my package. Good. He deserved worse, but that was out of my hands now. The archaeology club, once so enamored with Karen, had quietly distanced themselves from her. Another small victory, though it didn't bring me any real satisfaction. What did surprise me was how quickly Karen tried to rebuild her reputation. She threw herself into community work, organizing fundraisers and volunteering for local events. It was almost comical, the way she acted like nothing had happened, like she could scrub away her mistakes with enough good deeds. People aren't that forgiving, though. At least, not in a small town. As for me, I kept my head down and focused on rebuilding. Work became my escape, and I took on more projects than ever before, using the long hours to distract myself. Slowly, the numbness began to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of clarity. I started seeing a therapist not because I wanted to, but because a friend insisted. At first, I hated every minute of it. Sitting in that room, talking about my feelings, felt like the last thing I wanted to do. But over time, it helped. I began to see the cracks in my marriage for what they were, fault lines that had been there long before James entered the picture. Karen's affair was the catalyst, but the foundation had been crumbling for years. One day, my therapist asked me a question that stuck with me. What do you want your life to look like now? I didn't have an answer at the time. I'd been so consumed by the fallout of the divorce that I hadn't thought about what came next. But the question lingered, pushing me to think beyond the wreckage. The first step was reconnecting with the people who mattered, friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, family members I hadn't called in months. Slowly, I started rebuilding those relationships, finding comfort in their support. Then, I took a chance and joined a local hiking group. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, but I figured it was time to try something new. The group met every Saturday morning, trekking through the trails surrounding the town. At first, I felt out of place, but the more I went, the more I found myself enjoying it. It was on one of those hikes that I met Sarah. She wasn't flashy or dramatic, just kind and steady in a way that felt rare. We started talking during one of the longer trails, and before I knew it, we were meeting up outside of the group, grabbing coffee, going to the farmer's market, watching bad movies on rainy nights. Looking back now, I see the divorce not as the end of my life, but as the beginning of something else. Something quieter, simpler, and more authentic. Karen and I don't speak anymore, and I'm fine with that. Some wounds don't need to be revisited. But I've learned something important: betrayal doesn't define you. It hurts, it scars, but it doesn't have to be the end of your story. Life moves forward, whether you're ready or not. And sometimes, if you let it, it surprises you.